So hello everybody and welcome to this very special episode of the Low Season podcast in collaboration with the Berlin Guides Association. I'm Wouter Bernhardt, a tour guide from Berlin. And today I'm joined by two guests. First, I want to welcome Matt Robinson, president of the Berlin Guides Association. Matt has been a tour guide in Berlin for over 14 years. He has worked as a historical consultant at the Stasi Museum, which was the former East German police headquarters, and has his own tour company called Berlin Experience. Welcome, Matt.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And I think we're both very excited to also be joined today by travel writer, activist, television personality, CEO of his own travel company, overall tourism guru, Rick Steves. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Wouter. Nice to be with you.
Now, Rick, the way I wanted to set up the interview is to first ask you a couple of sort of quick fire round questions about you, your philosophy about travel. And after that, I'd like to sort of direct our conversation to Berlin in Germany so that we can discuss how you've seen these travel destinations change over the last couple of years. And eventually we'll arrive in the present to talk a little bit about the pandemic, how your travel company is doing, and how you see the future of tourism develop. Does that sound all right?
Sounds fun.
Beautiful. So maybe to start things off, I had the great pleasure of reading a whole bunch of writing of yours, former interviews you've given. But the very first thing that I'd like to ask you that has caught my attention was you said something on your radio show to Fred Plotkin last week or 2 weeks ago that you called yourself a pleasure activist. What does that mean?
Actually, Fred is the pleasure activist, and I'm inspired by him. So I'm one of his followers. And I guess a pleasure activist is, it's different than hedonism. I mean, hedonism would be, it's just not my thing. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but appreciating quality living. I mean, Fred is really into great Italian cuisine, the whole idea of 0-kilometer meals and controlling nature by going with it. And, you know, he's also an opera enthusiast, and he just knows how to really embrace culture and thoughtful living. And to me, that's a pleasure activist. So I endorse that, but he's the original pleasure activist.
You run an American travel business aimed at Americans that are curious about the world. Sam Anderson, in his New York Times article from last year, said of you that you're, quote, a sort of spiritual travel agent for America's curious but hesitant middle class. Would you say that's an accurate representation?
Yeah, he's brilliant and he nailed it. That's pretty much exactly what I like to do.
Why have you always thought it was important, maybe specifically for this group, to travel?
You know, it just reminded me, I used to be a piano teacher. The only other work I've ever had, other than tour guiding and my related work in travel, is teaching piano. And I was never a great pianist, but I love music and I love to play the piano. And I was really good at taking kids that didn't want Bach and Beethoven, and all they wanted to do was play pop music. And I was really good at getting them in there and turning them on to the beauties of classical music. And it's kind of like travel. I really want to take the biggest market segment. I don't want to be for sophisticates. I don't want to be for gourmets. I don't want to be for scholars. I just want to be for curious, good, open-minded people that want to broaden their life through travel. And I want to make travel accessible. For me, people talk about accessibility in terms of wheelchairs. Important. But I think of accessibility as just, can people get that into their brains? How can we organize it in a way where that can be accessible to them? I have a sort of an ethic in my TV show of never showing anything on TV that all of my viewers can't do also. A lot of TV hosts will show things that nobody else can do, but they can do because they got a big camera. I just don't even bother. If somebody says, you want to do this? Nobody else can do it. I say, no. This show is about accessibility. I want to show what other people can do and then equip and inspire them to do that themselves so they have the great travel experience.
You run a company that I think last year made it possible for about 30,000 Americans to travel through Europe. That's a massive, of course, achievement. How did you react to the news that the pandemic was going to sweep through Europe, eventually through the US, right at the beginning of the tour season? What did it mean for all those people that had booked for you with your company in 2020?
Well, it was devastating. We were euphoric. I had 100 wonderful guides. I think a lot of them from Berlin in my living room here. 100 of us, just if you get 100 guides together from 20 different countries and you're all excited about the best, you're coming off of the best year ever, you're gonna have a better year next year. We had just finished a 1-week-long workshop where we're all sharing notes and making sure we had our act together for this year's travel. And we had already sold 24,000 seats for tours for 2020. We were 80% sold out, and we just barely started. It was going to be an awesome year, and then it just swept over us like a tsunami. All of a sudden, nobody's traveling, and we're all unemployed. That was pretty disappointing. But I'm sitting right here looking out over my town, and I can see all sorts of institutions that are in just as difficult straits as us. So I'm really careful not to be feeling like, oh, life is difficult for me. We're all pretty blessed people. We're privileged people. Right now, and for years, we've been having good years, and now we have a bad year. So we have to play the cards that are dealt us. I've just had a talk with myself when this broke out. I'm not going to get depressed. I'm just going to keep a positive attitude. Patience is my middle name lately. Everybody is kind of chomping at the bit. People are eating in bubbles in Amsterdam now so they can sit on a canal and not get infected. I'm not that eager to go back to Amsterdam to sit in a bubble when I eat. It's just, it's really heartbreaking, and it's not heartbreaking for me, except I'm not making any money. I mean, that's a shame, I was enjoying that. But much more important to me was I was introducing a lot of people to Europe. For me to know that with the confidence I have in my guides, to know that 30,000 Americans could go to Europe and second degree or whatever, they would be my travelers because my guides do in their countries a better job than I could. And for me to be able to collect these people and say, have a Rick Steves travel experience and here, travel with this guy or that guy or this guy in these different countries. Guides that you've had on your podcast, Paul in Norway and Francesca in Rome and our friends right in Berlin. That is the biggest joy for me. And then also a big part of my work is not just the tour company, but it's the guidebooks. We probably sell 1 million guidebooks a year. So that's quite a bit bigger impact than 30,000 tourists. We have 50 different guidebooks. I think 25 out of the top 30 American guidebooks for traveling in Europe had Rick Steves on the cover. And we really are committed to having good guidebooks to help Americans travel. And the thought that guidebook sales would just go right into the ground. It's just 1 minute you're breaking your records, and the next minute you're sitting on thousands of guidebooks that you thought you were going to sell, and what are you going to do with them? So that's, from a business point of view, pretty depressing. Yeah. But what are you going to do? So we're just going to wait until we get through this crisis.
I think a nice talking point is, of course, the fact that in 1979 you wrote Europe Through the Back Door. Right. Where it outlines your philosophy on independent travel and sort of local experiences that are maybe not just the Eiffel Tower or the Brandenburg Gate. Now, to bring this also a bit to Berlin, in 1979, Berlin was still heavily divided. No one had any idea that 10 years later, the Berlin Wall would come down. Was Berlin in any sense a part of the Europe you were writing about?
Oh, absolutely. I loved traveling around Europe on both sides of the wall in the 80s. It was reality travel, and I really wanted Americans to humanize the people who were struggling in the Warsaw Pact region. It's a big part of my travels from a political point of view, and also just from a exciting point of view. I mean, I would take people. I was in Berlin on some tour. It was an old Cosmos tour or something. And we had some hiccup in the hotel arrangement, so we had to stay in the Palace Hotel or some big, the fancy hotel in East Berlin. It had all those reflective gold windows, you know. It was right there on the main street. Do you remember the hotel I'm talking about? It was
No, the
torn down.
hotel. I know the hotel that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And we would go in there, and we were I was just pretty unsophisticated kid in my 20s or 30s. And, you know, the big deal was you could change 5 West marks into enough East marks for you just to have an incredible night on the town. And we were going out there just meeting people and getting to know people and talking to people, and also going from rags to riches if you were a traveler with almost no money in the West. And it was an amazing experience. And I just wanted Americans to feel what it'd be like to live. We didn't imagine what it was like to live behind a wall. And I just thought it was really important to give Americans that experience. I remember I took a minibus into Hungary once, and I used to do minibus tours with no reservations, and I would just have 8 people on my minibus, and we'd run around, and every night we'd talk about what we're going to do tomorrow. And we were in Budapest. We're such big news that the Budapest University newspaper interviewed me because they didn't see many Western tourists, especially, you know, organized tours coming into Budapest then. And I remember we went to Lake Balaton. And I don't know anything about Lake Balaton. It's just where all the Hungarians had to go during their communist time because everybody had to go to the same vacation destination. Zakopane in Poland, and you know, the Black Sea coast of Varna, I guess, in Bulgaria, and Lake Balaton in Hungary. And I remember just the fascinating thing as a capitalist to go to a little hotel on the lake, which had rooms available. And I had 8 people on my minibus, and we needed beds, and I had money, and you're in business to rent beds. And I came in, I went up to the reception desk, and I said, can we have rooms? And they just didn't even care. And it was the weirdest thing that my money didn't open doors, because in Austria, money would open doors. They wanted to make that money. And it occurred to me, we were just a headache for them. They had an easy night coming up, and all of a sudden they'd have 9 Americans there, and they'd get some money. And those sort of things were just fascinating for a kid with a bunch of Americans who had never been to Hungary before, to be fumbling around and look at the schedule of the price schedule, one for Warsaw Pact travelers and one for Westerners. You know, that was an adventure in European travel that was part of my agenda. I wanted people to travel on both sides of the wall. And I thought it was valuable for Americans to experience that. But that was just when I was just barely getting started. Yeah.
I can imagine that once the wall came down, it became a bit more easy to convince people to sort of travel to Berlin. Still, I'd say Berlin is maybe not your typical German town. When people think about Germany, especially Americans, they think maybe of Bavaria more, Heidelberg,
Right.
Rothenburg, all these kind of cities.
Right.
What do you think Berlin has to offer?
2 things. First of all, it is interesting. Americans in the old days, like when I started traveling, there were still a lot of people with PTSD from World War II in the beer halls in Munich, I think, you know. And in the old days, we had a very strong affinity for Bavaria, I think, because that was the American sector, right? Americans didn't know anything about the Harz Mountains, even though that would be worth knowing about. I knew a little bit about northern Germany because my dad imported pianos from Braunschweig. So I went to a little bit of the north, but every American wanted to go where the American soldiers were. So that was, you know, Oberammergau, Garmisch-Partenkirchen and all that. And Munich was the darling of American travel dreams, along with Heidelberg, a long, long, long time ago. But I'm more of a historian, and I just love, you know, modern European history and German history. And Berlin has always been on my radar. But in the last generation, Berlin has become a much, much more rewarding place to visit to me than Munich. And Berlin, at the same time, Berlin has changed, obviously, more than any city I've traveled to in Europe. Example, the first TV show I made on Berlin, if you looked at the script, probably the vast majority of the text was in former West Berlin, and it was Kudamm and Zoo Station centered. When I went back with my new script to do Berlin a couple of years ago, I don't think we did anything in the former West out of the whole script. I don't even think we went over to KaDeWe or whatever, you know. It was just a total turnaround. And it just kind of, the proof was the core of Berlin from a sightseeing point of view was not the Berlin Americans knew until 1989. And then it took a while for Americans to get comfortable with going into the East because there was all this kind of ruin pub sort of culture and so on, which I found really fun, but it's not exactly what your typical mainstream American tourist is looking for. But Berlin's a challenge, Berlin's rewarding. Berlin is, for me, the #1 destination in Germany now. And that's not just because I've got some friends who are guides in Berlin.
Now, Matt, you've been a guide for 14 years, taking people around Berlin as well. Talking specifically about American travelers, Rick just spoke a bit about how Berlin became a bit more of the center of attention in Germany. Have you yourself experienced Americans traveling to Berlin more interested in certain aspects of the city? For example, going more towards the east, where it was in the beginning more located in West Berlin?
Yeah, certainly in the time that I've been here. I think there's an important point that Rick touched on there, and it's the matter of comfort. That the idea of Americans traveling to the American sector of what used to be Germany, Bavaria in the south, for a long time would have been the norm, where Berlin as a divided city up until 1989, 1990 was a little too far out of reach, this sort of off the beaten path aspect that Rick was talking about. That's definitely changed a lot with the way that certain routes have been established through Europe of the sort of classic Amsterdam, Berlin, Prague, I guess you could say now, as Berlin fits in there somehow. I think there are a lot of people that seem to be stumbling into Berlin more now than they were before. Seemingly from Rick's description, his idea of coming to Berlin was one of sort of historical fascination with the city, which at that time would have made sense. To stumble into Berlin in 1979, 1980, 80 something would have been quite hard, of course. Interestingly, it wasn't actually until I came to Berlin that I actually started hearing about Rick Steves, the phenomenon of Rick Steves as such, his name and the travel company. For me, growing up in England, my affinity was more with people like Michael Palin, for instance, was the big travel influencer that sort of opened doors, the Monty Python fame. And it was inspiring people to go to these places that they hadn't heard of or thought of, and to step out of their comfort zone. That gateway aspect is, and looking at the things that Rick's done, is something I think is very important when it comes to travel, making people feel comfortable, making people feel like there's something in between the unknown, that you can act as that sort of pivot in a way. It's the guide's responsibility, it's the tour company's responsibility, and it's something I've seen Rick do quite successfully as well, of making people feel like they can step out of their comfort zone but not be completely exposed. That for me is also a huge question with Corona, how we're going to see this play out, and a sort of physical sense of how people respond to being exposed to the elements outside, wandering around, interacting with each other, how tourism is going to pick up from that, how they're going to feel about placing themselves in uncomfortable situations, or whether in future we're going to see people travel for escapism primarily, to go to places where they feel comfortable on beaches somewhere, as opposed to being exposed to uncomfortable environments and uncomfortable themes, which is quite frankly something that Berlin specializes in when it comes to 20th century history, confronting people with everything that the city's been through.
I also thought it was quite interesting to hear your commencement address for the class of 2020. You sent out, Rick, a message in, I think, May, a couple months ago, to the class of 2020. You had a very important message to them. And you decided to refer to an element of German history, namely the moment you were at the opening of the new Reichstag. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that experience was like.
Well, I'm always a little bit lacking confidence when I talk about European things with Europeans. I love to do that because I get settled, I get set straight. It's so easy as an American to have a experience on the road and think that's the way it is, and then have a friend in Europe sit you down and say, well, you know, there's more to it than that. But you know, and Americans are a little bit probably too focused on the Cold War, because it's one war that we kind of won, you know. I just think it's a fascinating part of tourism, and in you know, in Italy you talk about the Renaissance, and in Ireland you talk about pub music, and in Germany you talk a lot about 20th century history. I produced a 1-hour TV special on fascism. I produced a 1-hour TV special on the Reformation in Germany. I just love German history. And I happened to be in Berlin on the opening day or the opening week of the new Reichstag. And I was up on top of that building and surrounded, as I say, well, what do I say? I say this in my class all the time in my travel as a political act talk. I just say, what do I say? That when you're traveling, you're part of history. You're there, you're surrounded by history, and you've got to recognize that history is not something you read in books. It's happening all around us, and we are players in it. And when you travel, you have this amazing opportunity to be in the midst of it. And example, I was on the top of the Reichstag building in Germany on opening day, and you know, this is a building that has a very interesting history over the last century in Germany. And for a generation, it was, well, you know, I'm fascinated by this idea that Russians and Germans were fighting on the rooftop of the Parliament building and so on, and that's quite dramatic. And then all of a sudden the war is over, Germany is divided, the capital goes to Bonn, and the former Parliament building is a bombed out hulk sitting on no man's land, Berlin Wall. Suddenly the Cold War is over, Germany's united again, capital goes back to Berlin, they need a new capital building. What do you do? In good European style, you don't bulldoze the old building, you renovate it, and you incorporate on the top a beautiful modern element, the glass dome, and you open it to the public. Beautiful thing. So designed for German citizens, but tourists are welcome to walk that spiral ramp to the very top and look down literally over the shoulders of the legislators and see what's going on their desk. Powerful architectural symbolism, as Germany's been jerked around by its politicians too much in the last century now. I think this is a statement. German citizens are going to keep an eye on their legislators, on their governors. And I was on top of that building on opening day, surrounded by teary-eyed Germans. And then I always get a laugh out of this in my lectures. I slept to 1,000 people. Anytime you're surrounded by teary-eyed Germans, something exceptional is going on. and then this was and many of those teary eyes were old enough to remember Berlin when it was just rubble in the late 1940s, you see. And this was the beautiful, emotional moment when there was no more communism, no more fascism. So I have to talk to right-wingers and left-wingers. You know, some people are glad there's no more fascism. Others focus on the communism. So no more communism, no more fascism. United country, starting a new century with a new Capitol building, united, looking forward into a beautiful, promising future. And to this day, Germany is a leading power in the European Union. I just get excited even talking about it right now, just explaining it as a teacher to you guys. But that's a beautiful moment. And then the lesson for me is, I was with other Americans up there who didn't have a clue. They were not touched by it. They didn't notice those tears. They didn't understand the context. They were just bummed out because the air conditioning was not working, or they wanted ice cubes in their Coca-Cola, or their batteries were running out. And I just thought, I'm living in a dumbed down society. I don't want to live in a dumbed down society. And there's powerful people in the United States that would find it convenient and more profitable if we were all just dumbed down, mindless producer consumers. And I vowed right then and there in my own little world as a travel writer and a tour guide that I'm going to expect my travelers, my viewers, my readers to be smartened up, to be engaged. And I'm not going to dumb them down. You make more money when you take people to the beach and just frequent flyer miles and fun in the sun. But that's not what I do. My mission is to expose Americans to challenging things, to get them out of their comfort zone and help them go home with the most beautiful souvenir, and that's a broader perspective. And that's how I measure my profit. You see, so, and then I mentioned, I'm really sad in the United States that we don't seem to value the importance of a well-educated electorate. And I really have this sense that Germany has paid the consequences of having an electorate that could be led astray. And I really find that in Germany, there's an interest in investing in people's education, not as a political agenda to teach them this way or that way, but just to teach them to be good citizens. That makes a country stronger, regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum. And this is something I like to bring up. And this is a very good, concrete example of the value of travel, what we can learn from our travels. And for me as a tour guide and a teacher, and I know that my guides, I've got 150 guides that in good times earn a lot of their living taking Rick Steves. So somebody's got to guide those 30,000 Americans around Europe. We all believe in this value of exposing Americans to the realities of this planet so they can realize that they are 4% of the planet and there's 96% out there, and it's nice to get to know the neighbors. You know, I was just thinking the other day, if I could do the most profitable tour, it would be taking not just 25 Americans around Europe, but taking 25 people that would go to a Trump rally around Europe. I would love to have 20, it's not the kind of people I'd want to hang out with, but as a teacher, as a tour guide, what I would really love the opportunity to do is have 25 people out of that Trump rally. You see them, they're the people behind Trump when he talks, you know. Take them to Europe and let them talk to Germans. Let them talk to people in Berlin. Let them let's sit with my relatives in Scandinavia and understand why they believe in government, you know. Go to Spain and Italy and enjoy the passeggiata and the paseo. You know, hike to the Alps and talk about the environment. That would be such a thrill. And that's to a certain degree what we do is we get Americans out of their comfort zone with great local guides, mostly European guides who can speak with authority. When I did my fascism show, you don't want to hear from Rick Steves about fascism. I just did a show about hunger. You don't want to hear from Rick Steves, this privileged white guy in Ethiopia and Guatemala, about how we can fight hunger. You want to hear from local people who are in the trenches, who really understand and who can speak for that community. It's just what we need to do. We need to be a conduit, connect curious, in my case, Americans. My market is Americans. I don't make any apologies for that. I really am working to help Americans get comfortable with the rest of the world. I always say my mission is to inspire and equip Americans to venture beyond Orlando, you see. So we get them beyond Orlando, and then we get them in touch with good local guides. And whether it's on one of my tour buses or whether it's on a TV show, sitting down with a local guide. We had wonderful German guides. Holger in Berlin, you might know Holger, helped us out with our TV show. And we had good guides in Nuremberg and in Munich. And I'm so thankful for those local voices because they have the credibility and they have the intimacy to the whole history and everything. And it makes my job much more productive, I think.
There's one thing, of course, and I think I'd like to hear Matt's opinion on that as well, or his experience. Over the last couple of years, we feel that not just the US, but the world has become ever more polarized with opinions really diametrically opposed to each other. That must also, and from my own experience, that also comes out on tour, especially when you talk about 20th century Berlin history. There's always people trying to take that history and use it for their own political benefit, or seeing their own story sort of represented in there. That can also lead to conflict, even on tour. Is there a way that you have a policy, or do you talk with your guides about how to mitigate conflict, especially when you're talking about difficult bits of history, and especially during this difficult political climate that we're living in?
Yeah. Is that to me? Or
oh, sorry,
Rick?
no, that's to Rick, and then I'd like to hear from Matt.
This is, for me, I've been, for 25 years, I led tours, and it was endlessly entertaining for me. I could do 4 of my best. I just did the Best of Europe tour normally over and over, 20 days, around the best. And it was always interesting for me because the challenge, how transformational can I make this tour? How can I get people out of their comfort zone, and how can I help them learn? How can I fast track their learning? And but you got to be careful not to abuse the bully pulpit, and you don't accomplish anything by cornering somebody in a concentration camp and hitting them on the head with history. You've got to set them up and let them explore and draw their own conclusions. So that's an art. But I've got the mic, and I've got 25 Americans who are paying me to be their guide for 3 weeks, and I'm running around Europe, and I get to shape the curriculum every day I'm on that mic. And I know that my bus is half conservatives and half liberals, half Democrats, half Republicans. Good people, there's no doubt about it. They're good people that just have a different worldview and a different politics. So I don't judge them. I just want to help teach them in an effective way. And it's just been a personal challenge for me ever since the start, is how can I be a more effective teacher? And I've learned that people have to draw their own conclusions. You can't tell them what to think. I've also learned that if you are a traveler, if you enjoy escargot, if you like to speak a foreign language, if you really believe that America is not exceptional in God's eyes, you're at a disadvantage with a lot of conservatives because they think God blesses America first, you know. So you've got to win them over. You don't want them to slam the door on you like a lot of people would, and they'd never get to first base with them. So I have learned as a tour guide that it's important for me to acknowledge that I'm glad I'm running my business in the United States, where I can be nimble, where I can employ people easily, and then run my business the way I want to, where I can turn on a dime, where I don't have a lot of restrictions. And then I even mentioned that I'm glad I'm not running my business in Europe because it would be too constraining for me. I couldn't be that guerrilla entrepreneur. And I say I just love the challenge of working hard, creating a good product, making a lot of money, and paying my staff well, and giving a good value to my customers. Okay, right now, all of those cynical conservatives are going, oh, maybe he's one of us, you know. And then I let them know that I'm a Christian and I love going to church, and that's kind of, oh, okay, that's a nice thing. And then I also, I remind them that the world is thankful for America standing up for freedom with our military. And that, I tell them a story about how I went to a castle in France, a little mom and pop chateau, and they wouldn't let us shoot our camera in the castle until they I gave us wine and cheese and brought out their 48-star American flag. And this is the flag we raised over our community the day the American troops freed us from Nazi tyranny, you know. And Europe to this day is thankful that America had the courage and the commitment to freedom to save Europe, and that we waged a battle of economic attrition with the Soviet Union. And today, Europe is free, and to a certain degree because of American strength and commitment to freedom and power. So all of that stuff, then you realize you're not a crackpot in their perspective. It's really important. It sounds like I'm just kissing up maybe or something like that, but I think it's a real reasonable thing to acknowledge, and it's very effective because then people will listen to you. And then it's a growing experience, and you see the growing pains of a broadening perspective over the course of that tour. And when you get done, those people do fly home with the souvenir that I want them to fly home with. And that's a respect for Europe, a respect for people who see and do things differently. And what I love to do, and I've learned that from taking educational tours down into Latin America over the years, is have these reflection times where the guide is not the teacher, but the guide is the honest conduit that just translates and facilitates the group meeting with different people. And when I did that in Central America, you would meet with people with all sorts of different perspectives. And the guide would facilitate that, and the people would process that, and then they would make their own decision. It's like, what was the joke about in the Soviet Union? You got to read the Pravda, and you got to read, the one's called the news and one's called the truth. And then you got to read both newspapers, but somebody would say there's no news in the truth and there's no truth in the news. Or in Central America, everybody would buy the liberal newspaper and the conservative newspaper because both had an agenda. And it's kind of like that process when you're traveling. But when I work with my guides, I encourage them to talk politics and talk religion. I think it's a beautiful thing to talk about if it's done respectfully.
What do you, Matt, have that same experience as we're talking about people with sort of radically different opinions, not just from you, but also from the people that they're traveling with? How do you deal with such situations?
I've certainly been in some pretty hairy situations myself. I've never kicked anybody off one of my tours. I've never felt that that removing somebody from a situation was a better idea than discourse, because to remove somebody, I think, would be a failure somehow. And I recall definitely in 2015, it was probably the worst year, as there was the run up to the US presidential elections. And we had sort of half down the aisle, you've got Trump supporters, and half down the aisle, there were Clinton supporters. And quite often there'd be points on tours where the groups that I would lead, but sort of, you could see them fizzling a little. And often the terms would be, this is just like da 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 da. Now, whether or not you actually pick up on that or not, whether you run with that or you let it sort of bounce around in their minds a little bit, is the art of guiding, I think. And the sense that not every problem is a nail, not every solution is the hammer, and that, or more importantly, that the truth never lies, but when it does, it lies somewhere in between, which was, I think, Rick's point when it comes to the newspapers, that you have to read both of them to get both sides, and then you figure out what the reality is, somewhere in the middle. For me as a guide, I've always felt that it's the gateway aspect of being able to show different perspectives to people and allow them to reach their own conclusions. It's something that I picked up actually from listening to Rick and realizing, actually, here's somebody that's realized this as well in my own time as being a guide, which is something that I started. I'm originally a journalist, and on the ground picked up my guiding skills and figured out how to work a crowd, how to deal with people, how to present certain information and how people would respond to that. Nobody taught me how to be a guide, really, beyond me actually figuring it out on the ground, that you can't just hit people with information. You can't just expect them to respond to it outright, that it's I don't want to say there's a sort of conjuring or a magician's trick to it, but if you can sort of present information in a very perhaps inoffensive way, more so, that it's not hitting somebody with it, but it's sort of smuggling it in by the side. It's a much more effective way of approaching it. And that's one of the wonderful things for me for travel, for tourism, that I realized that it is this vehicle. My background is in journalism, and I know the strength of telling facts and figures and laying down a story and an arc, but to actually have the possibility to meet people where they don't suspect that they're actually going to be approached with these kind of things. Even coming to Berlin with its serious history, not to expect to be confronted with the level of revelation that they might have in a city like Berlin. Discourse is important, and trying to engage, I think, both sides of the aisle with each other is something that's important on a tour as well, beyond just being the person at the front proselytizing and saying, this is how it is, you need to believe this, to engage the people on either side and say, well, you're saying this, why are you saying this? Is this relevant to what we've just discussed? And approach it in that way. Trump supporters, yeah, I've had buses of Trump supporters, and I've engaged with, I say, Clinton supporters as they were at the time, or Democrat supporters who've also had some pretty strange ideas of their own. But as to whether they pick them up from somewhere, that they've read something, that they've heard something about Europe or about Germany, the immigrant issue, of course, in 2015, the refugee crisis, of course, it was exactly the same time, and there were a lot of people also, where are all the Syrians, and is it dangerous around here? Should I be wandering around on my own? And then to actually see the reality on the ground and see that it differs from their perception. It would be a real shame if we don't see that in travel anytime soon with this Corona situation, if people don't have the opportunity to travel and have that possible outlet there, whereby travel, I say, broadens your horizons, of course, but there's something else in there that I see, and I think Rick sees it as well. And I know a lot of the guides in our Guides Association see it, and that makes them exceptional, that they're not just there to present information, but there's the opportunity to also help people, guide people towards something.
Hey, Matt, isn't that one of the joys of your work, is just dealing with that challenge of effectively teaching rather than hitting people on the head with stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a teaching job at the end of the day. It's a matter of teaching and sharing information with people, of course, and presenting in a way that people find thrilling, attractive. And the guys that we have in our association come from different angles. Some of them are entertainers, of course, and they've come from a sort of maybe a theatrical background. Some, like myself, journalists. Some are academics. Some are historians, and they're dealing with facts and figures and information. But it all seems to converge when it comes together properly. It converges to being able to engage with people and being able to connect with their humanity as well.
And if you do it well, the surveys at the end of the tour will be uniformly good.
Yeah.
Even with the Republicans and the Democrats.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge, is to have the person who doesn't see it the way you might see it, to enjoy the process of exploring his or her preconceptions.
I've also, I think, probably been blessed with a somewhat of a cheeky grin that seems to get me through saying certain things to people that that maybe other people might get in trouble with, but I've never had a problem with saying, actually, that's not right. But have you thought about this? And if you can approach somebody by not making them feel like they're being condescended to or being belittled. It's
the worst thing for me is to talk to a tour guide that says, no, in my company, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. You can't even talk about soccer. I mean, that goes along with religion.
Sex, politics, and religion. That's all I'm interested in talking about at the end of the day.
I tell my guides, we're all in this together. We respect each other. We don't all come from the same life experience. We can differ and we can learn from each other. We don't have to all agree afterwards. But I always tell my guides, because they're nervous because surveys are really so important. If you got to keep the customers happy and all that kind of stuff. But I say, if you go on a limb to explain why your society pays extra money and provides healthcare to everybody, and if it pisses off your American tourists, we'll stand by our guides. I mean, we want to learn from it. We don't want to offend people or upset people, but occasionally it's higher risk to do that than to take the easy road. But we want to risk offending somebody in order to make it more likely they're going to go home having had a transformational travel experience. Transformational is a word that people in tourism have thrown around for decades. And it's generally just kind of baloney, but you can take transformational seriously, and you can have that sort of a broadening experience through your travels. And the guides I know in Berlin are so into learning from history that I think that they're all, my experience is they're pretty much on board with that idea.
Sorry. There's just an additional point there of the addressing the crowd aspect of it as well. If there is one person who maybe disagrees with a certain aspect of something you've explained, and I very rarely would explain something as my opinion of something, but rather this is also how it is, and I'm presenting your perspective. But their disagreement doesn't mean that the 30 other people perhaps that are there are also disagreeing with you at the same time, and the conversation that you may have with them, you may feel is not so immediately fruitful, but is as much for their sake as it is for everybody else that's around as well. And that addressing the audience aspect, I think, is important there. And
there is that white elephant on the bus of, we don't want to offend the Trump people, it's very awkward for a tour guide to have to deal with that. And I think it needs to be addressed right from the opening meeting, that we're all, we all respect each other. We may have different politics, and that's fine, and we're here to learn.
Ricky, you often mention in your podcast that with your radio show that the pandemic is, of course, currently grounding everybody, but you also say that it will pass and things will get back to normal. I hear it on almost every episode. Do you really believe that? First, that it will pass, and second, that things will actually get back to normal?
Well, I hope that very strongly. This is more serious than what I thought going into it. It's going to take longer than what I hoped, but I do believe that we're impatient. I mean, we've lived our lifetimes. You guys, I think I'm older than you guys. We've all lived our lifetimes without having. Well, I couldn't say that for people who lived through the Cold War in Germany, but for me, this is the first major thing that's been a disruption in my life. 9/11 was nothing in my life. The Great Recession was nothing in my business. I just didn't hardly notice it. I skated right through it. I missed Vietnam. I mean, there's been nothing in my life that's been a big overturner of plans and aspirations. So now I'm 65 years old, and things are on hold for a couple of years. I'm okay with that. I was really fascinated by the thought I read recently about, if you were born in 1900 and you were a industrious, hardworking person that wanted to make a difference in the world, you had all sorts of aspirations. 1914, you got World War I. 1918, you got the great pandemic, or the flu pandemic. 1929, you got the Depression. 1930s, you got all the chaoses, fascism's rising in Europe. 1939, you're 39 years old and World War II breaks out. Finally, you're 50 years old before there's any sort of real extended stability. So we've got this right now. We've been locked up for 4 or 5 months. Our country's screwing it up, so we're still at 0 point. We're still in the first base. We haven't had a chance to progress. It's occurring to me that we're probably more reliant on a vaccine than I realized. But I do think we're going to get a vaccine. And there's the odd thing about this is there's no way of knowing its trajectory. There's no way of knowing how bad it's going to get or how long it's going to last. That's the first time I've had anything hinting like that in my career. And it is easy to lay in bed in the morning thinking, oh, I got to get out of bed and work today. And are we ever going to come out of this? But, I'm keeping 100 people on my payroll, not because I want to have a employment service. I mean, I have an ethical responsibility, I think, to keep them employed as long as I can. But there's also, I've got an interest in having a team in place for when we come out of this so we can rekindle our tour company. If I didn't believe that we'd come out of it, I don't think I would be so committed to the well-being of my company right now. If I believe deep down inside there's not going to be any more organized tourism in the future, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now as the head of Rick Steves Europe, which has 100 people on their payroll.
You've been heralded for paying these people from your own pocket, and I think rightfully so. It is something that not a lot of tour companies can actually say. A lot of people just either fired people or fired and rehired. There's a whole bunch of shifting around, a lot of panic. There's of course also the situation with the guides, mostly freelancers living all throughout Europe with all kind of different securities in terms of like unemployment benefits. Do you think that in the future, a post-pandemic tourism future, there is room for maybe an employed guide? Or do you think that the model of tourism and with travel companies and guides just doesn't lend itself for anything other than freelancers?
That's a good question. I don't know. It seems to me guiding is freelancing. Guides do work here, they do work there. It's seasonal. I know a lot of people here do, summer sports in the summer and winter sports in the winter, and they cobble it together. A lot of guides want to work half the year. A lot of guides, it's their primary source of income. I'm different, I think, than a Kontiki or a Globus or Cosmos. We're a travel company that takes people around Europe. We write guidebooks, we make TV shows, we make our radio shows, we promote travel. It's heartbreaking not to be able to provide this employment to our guides. It is really heartbreaking. And I can't tell you what a high I was on with all of our guides in town, and we had this esprit de corps, and we were just so good. We were so ready, and we were going to do all of this. And then we fly home, and everything grinds to a halt. It's just horrible. I don't know what it's just not fair that some people have employment and other people don't. It's not fair that revenue grinds to a halt when you did nothing wrong. The last revenue I got was in October as a tour company. So I got to keep my team together. We invested a lot of money bringing everybody over. We expected to have a great year and have guides. Our concern was how do we have enough guides for this thing? That was our big concern, was do we have enough guides for the demand? And suddenly we don't. So I'm unusual as a tour company because I'm privately held. If I was publicly held, all the profit would have been dispersed to the stockholders, right? And you can't call up the stockholders and say, things are not good anymore. We need that profit back. It doesn't work that way. I'm glad I'm privately held so that, I can keep my team together. But my big question is, how long is this zero revenue going to last? And I look out and I see the same thing happening with arts centers, with theaters, with schools, with sports, with everything requires a crowd. That's the sad thing to me. In order to be viable, in order to employ people well, to be profitable, and to offer a quality product for a good price, those are all the things you got to be able to do. You got to pack the house. You got to fill the plane, fill the hotel, fill the restaurant, fill the tour bus, fill the stadium, fill the concert hall. And as long as people can't gather, there's a reality here. And you got to produce to have money. In the United States, we've got this ability to bail people out and provide unemployment to people who used to work in hotels and restaurants that aren't in business anymore. But that can't go on forever. Something's got to, we've got to start producing. And that really worries me. It really worries me. I'm hoping I can survive for a couple of years, you know.
Yeah. Maybe as a final question, you see travel as a political act. You wrote a book with that title, really making an effort in sort of pushing Americans to see the rest of the world, to sort of break out of that bubble. Now, after 9/11, it seemed that you really attempted to convince people that they needed to travel more and not less, right?
Yeah.
This is like the scariness of terrorist attacks, and then eventually also terrorist attacks happening in Europe. But now with Corona, with COVID-19, this pandemic is a completely different beast. It is a crisis that we're in. But the main advice seems to be stay at home, not travel more, but stay at home. Right. In this highly divisive political climate, how do you feel about this idea of people having to stay at home while you actually want them to travel and go abroad and open their minds?
I have no problem with it. There's a more fundamental challenge now than keeping my business alive, and that's getting over this crisis, this virus. I don't want people to travel now, frankly. I want us to get a handle on this virus so we can travel in the near future. Patience is not an American forte. You know, if we have an economic policy and it's necessary and it's smart and we vote for it and it's an investment, it's good economic hygiene, and 2 years later we're not all doing just great, we elect somebody else and then we throw that out the door and we try something different. You know, you got to embrace the truth, and then you got to be patient and wait for it to take hold. In the United States, everything is about the quarterly profit statement, with no regard for sustainability. People jump around with their investments, and they just want to be faster than everybody else and more nimble than everybody else and screw the future. This is not a good prescription for anybody's financial well-being down the road. But that's the problem we've got now with the mania of quarterly profit statements and the dishonest way we do accounting, where we don't have to pay for the long-term consequences of our business. This last year, I gave myself a self-imposed carbon tax just to try to help my company be carbon neutral. And we invested $1 million in 10 organizations working to mitigate climate change in the developing world. Very proud of that. And then this year, we're going to tell all of our travelers, you know, we're paying for to mitigate the carbon you create by flying to Europe and back. So you don't shame people out of flying. You just pay the fee so that you can fly in a carbon neutral kind of way. It's nothing heroic. It's what we should be taxed on anyways, because we're producing that carbon and it's our responsibility. And we're not doing anything to help. We're just cutting how we hurt, you see. But it's a good step, and it's a reasonable step to expect other tour organizers to do that. And we were doing it. I'm going to do it this year, but in a scaled down way, because it's supposed to be a function of $30 per traveler that we put on our tours. And this year, 30 times 0 is not a lot of money, you know. I just think that going forward, the whole reality has changed, and things that seemed common sense and things that seemed fair last year, right now, everything is upended. And it's easy to feel like a victim, but when you look out Everybody's a victim. So again, do I want people to travel? Well, of course I want people to travel. But do I want to encourage them to travel prematurely? No, my problems are not as bad as society's problems right now. And America's problems are not as bad as the developing world's problems right now. So I'm approaching life now more as a citizen than as a tour organizer, more as a caring neighbor than as a businessman. And I've got a responsibility, and I've got some wherewithal to contribute in ways that I'm excited about, and I want to do the ethical thing. But my initiative right now is not everybody get out and travel. I mean, I'm not going to be the first tour company out of the gate. What Rick Steves travel is not social distancing. Rick Steves Europe travel is the opposite of social distancing. You go to France to be kissed on the cheeks. You go to Italy to pack into the piazza and then lick a ice cream cone as you're doing the passeggiata. You know, you go to Bavaria to slide on those benches until you get slivers in your butt, drinking beer and clinking those steins and having fun with new friends. You go to a pub in Ireland, knowing that, what do they say? Strangers are just friends who've yet to meet. It's all about people. If I think of my work, what distinguishes a good trip? Whether it's a TV show, a guidebook, or one of our tours, or just my own vacation, the experience is the success of the experience is really how many people did you connect with, not how many cliches did you see on stage. So if there's going to be an interim period, I really think that things are going to open up. They're going to open up. First, it's going to be people traveling locally, I think. Bavarians hiking in the foothills of the Alps, Romans going to the Tuscan hill towns, French going to the French Riviera. Then you're going to have individuals within safe countries traveling. My cousin in Norway, you guys would know better than me, but I think the situation is my cousin in Norway loves to go to the Greek Isles. She just flew to the Greek Isles knowing she'll have a quarantine waiting for her when she gets back to Norway, but she's doing that trip. I've got a friend, I think in one of our guides, that's just starting a minibus tour in Ireland. Wow, that's pretty impressive, you know. One of my guides is going out with in Spain is going out with one of my employees here in Seattle. They couldn't get together in Spain or the United States. But they both flew to Istanbul, and now they're having a beautiful reunion there. So there's going to be individuals that have a reason to travel, and that's going to be good. There'll be individuals buying my Rick Steves guidebooks before there'll be Rick Steves tour buses going around. So individuals locally, then individuals internationally, and then last, sadly, things will be stable enough and reliable enough for us to put together buses sold to Americans to fly across the Atlantic and meet in Amsterdam or Paris or Berlin or whatever, and then do their trip. And there's going to be that interim period where everybody's going to want to go, let's get going again. And I just want to take a pause. I mean, America's trying to start up professional baseball, and they've got this truncated little season and playing to empty stadiums. And just yesterday, one of the teams has 14 cases of corona, 14 cases, and they all fly home, and that's the end of that. I don't want to have the tour bus equivalent of that by being impatient. So it's going to take a while, and that's leadership and that's honesty, just to be straight about that, and not let my eagerness to start making money again or my eagerness to start employing our guides again get in the way of that common sense patience. It's a real difficult thing. It's heartbreaking. Yeah. It is heartbreaking.
Well, Rick and Matt, I think I want to maybe leave it here. I want to thank you both for joining the conversation. For the people who are watching this, Rick Steves is the writer of several books and the host of the television series Rick Steves Europe. You can find more information about Rick and his travel wisdom in the show notes, or go to, of course, ricksteves.com. This conversation was a collaboration between the Low Season podcast and the Berlin Guides Association. If you want to know more about both, basically, you can find links also in the show notes. I want to thank also Jim McDonough for brokering and setting up this interview. I want to thank both you, Matt, and both you, Rick, for joining me right here, right now.
Thank you very much, Matt. Nice to talk with you also. And
pleasure as well, Rick.
This is with your work. Okay, happy travels, even if we're just staying for a while.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.